Fantastic, Mr. Fox. So we are up to chapter 4. What's happened so far? We've got 3 farmers. We've got Boggis, Bunce and Bean. And then Mr. Fox lived with Mrs. Fox and 4 baby foxes. I don't know if they're baby, they're little foxes. Oh yeah. And there was the shooting. So the farmers went outside his hole under the tree, and they tried to get him, and he came out and they shot his tail. Here we go. Oh, and the farmers have decided that the best way to get him would be to dig him out. So chapter 4 is called The Terrible Shovels. Down in the hole, Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking, oh here's Teddy, tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. It was the finest tail for miles around, she said between licks. It hurts, said Mr. Fox. I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better. And will it soon grow again, Dad? Said one of the small foxes. It'll never grow again, said Mr. Fox. I shall be tailless for the rest of my life. He looked very glum. He's a sad fox. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off, but Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain in the stump of his tail. Well, he thought, I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they've found our hole, we're going to have to move out as soon as possible. We'll never get any peace if we... ... What's that? He turned his head sharply and listened. The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise a fox can ever hear. The scrape, scrape, scraping of shovels digging into the soil. Wake up! He shouted. They're digging us out. Mrs. Fox was wide awake in 1 second. She sat up, quivering all over, shaking. Are you sure that's what it is? She whispered. I'm positive. Listen. They'll kill my children, said Mrs. Fox. Never, said Mr. Fox. But darling, they will, sobbed Mrs. Fox. You know they will. I can see it's digging through there, look. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch went the shovels above their heads. Small stones and bits of earth began falling from the roof of the tunnel. How will they kill us, Mummy? Asked one of the small foxes. His round black eyes were huge with fright. Will there be dogs? He said. Mrs. Fox began to cry. She gathered her 4 children close to her and held them tight. Suddenly there was an especially loud crunch above their heads, and the sharp end of a shovel came right through the ceiling. The sight of this awful thing seemed to have an electric effect upon Mr. Fox. Loads of words. He jumped up and shouted, I've got it, come on, there's not a moment to lose. Why didn't I think of it before? Think of what, Dad? A fox can dig quicker than a man, shouted Mr. Fox, beginning to dig. Nobody can dig as quick as a fox. The soil began to fly out furiously behind Mr. Fox, and as he started to dig for his dear life with his front teeth, Mrs. Fox ran forward to help him, and so did the 4 children. Go downwards, ordered Mr. Fox. We've got to go deep as we possibly can. The tunnel began to grow longer and longer, and sloped steeply downward. Deeper and deeper below the surface of the ground it went. The mother and the father and all 4 children were digging together, their front legs moving so fast you couldn't see them. And gradually the scrunching and scraping of shovels became fainter and fainter. After about an hour, Mr. Fox stopped digging. Hold it, he said. They all stopped, and they turned and looked back up the long tunnel where they'd just dug. All was quiet. Phew, said Mr. Fox. I think we've done it. They'll never get as deep as this. Well done, everyone. They all sat down, panting for breath, and Mrs. Fox said to her children, I should like you to all know that if it wasn't for your father, we'd all be dead by now. Your father is a fantastic fox. Mr. Fox looked at his wife and she smiled. He loved her more than ever when she said things like that. Dig, 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 and dig, 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 dig. They don't need shovels to dig, they just use their paws, don't they? Oh, chapter 5, the terrible tractors. As the sun rose the next morning, Boggis, Bunce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could put a house into it. That's massive. But they had not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. Dang and blast, said Boggis. Whose rotten idea was this? Bean's idea, said Bunce. Boggis and Bunce were both stared at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider and put his flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. Listen, he said angrily. I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I'm not giving in till I've strung him up on my front porch as dead as a dumpling. We can't get him by digging, that's for sure, said Fat Boggis. I've had enough of digging. Bunce, the little pot-bellied dwarf, looked up at Bean and said, Have you got any more stupid ideas then? What? Said Bean. I can't hear you. Bean never took a bath. He never washed, and as a result his ear holes were clogged with all sorts of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. That made him deaf. Speak louder, he said to Bunce, and Bunce shouted back, Got any more stupid ideas? Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had a boil coming there, and it itched. What we need on this job, he said, is machines. Mechanical shovels. We'll have them out in 5 minutes with mechanical shovels. It was a pretty good idea, and the other two had to admit it. All right then, Bean said, taking charge. Boggis, you stay here. We'll see the fox doesn't escape. Bunce and I will go and fetch our machinery. If he tries to get out, shoot him. Shoot him quick. Long, thin Bean walked away, and Tiny Bunce trotted after him. Fat Boggis stayed where he was, with his gun pointing down the foxhole. Look at his ears. He's got all dirt coming out of his ears. Blech. You're having to shout to him. Can't hear because he's got dirty chewing gum and flies and bugs in his ears. Oh no, here come the mechanical diggers. Soon, 2 enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on their front ends came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one and Bunce the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters. Here we go then, shouted Bean. Death to the fox, shouted Bunce. It's not very nice, was it, Bear? The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big tree under which the fox had dug his hole in the first place toppled like a matchstick, and on all sides rocks were sent flying, trees falling, and the noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel, the foxes crouched, listening to the terrible clanging and banging overhead. What's happening, Dad? Cried the small foxes. What are they doing? Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. It's an earthquake, cried Mrs. Fox. Look, said one of the small foxes, our tunnel got shorter. I can see daylight. They looked around, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now. In the circle of daylight behind them, they could see 2 huge black tractors almost upon them. Tractors, shouted Mr. Fox. Mechanical shovels. Dig for your lives. Dig, dig, dig. Oh. Hang on, we're on another chapter. Chapter 6. How big's this one? Oh, we can just squeeze another chapter in. Chapter 6, the race. Now, there was a desperate race. The machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. After an hour, as the machines bit away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. They chomped lots of soil out. Sometimes the foxes would gain a little ground, and the clanking noises would grow fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, We're going to make it, I'm sure we are. Then a few moments later, the machines would come back at them, and the crunch of the mighty shovels would get louder and louder. Once the foxes actually saw the sharp metal edge of one of the shovels as it scraped the earth just behind them. Keep going, my darling, shouted Mr. Fox. Don't give up. Keep going, the fat Boggis shouted to Bunsen Bean. We'll get him any moment. Have you caught sight of him yet? Bean called. Not yet, shouted Boggis. But I think you're close. I'll pick him up in my bucket, shouted Bunsen, and chop him to pieces. But by lunchtime the machines were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. Farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. Hey there, Mr. Fox, shouted Bunce, leaning out of his tractor. I'm coming to get you now. You've had your last chicken, you had, Boggis. You'll never come prowling round my farm again. A sort of madness had taken hold of the three men. Tall, Skinny Bean, Dwarfish, Potbelly Bunce were driving their machines like maniacs, racing the motors and making the shovels dig at terrific speed. Fat Boggis was hopping around like a dervish and shouting, faster, faster. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what had happened to the hill. It's a proper hole. Look, it started off like that. It started off like a hill, and by 5 o'clock it's a hole. The hole the machines had dug was like a crater of a volcano. It was such an extraordinary sight that the crowds of people came rushing from surrounded villages to have a look. They stood at the edge of the crater and stared down at Boggis, Bunsen Bean. Hey there, Boggis, what's going on? We're after a fox. You must be mad. People jeered and laughed. This only made the three farmers more furious and more obstinate and more determined than ever not to give up until they caught the fox. Right, next chapter we can start on is chapter 7. We'll never let him go. Teddy's going to look after the book for us. Hi.